Imagine yourself as Commander Tairo Aoki, the seasoned air officer standing on the flight deck of the flagship Akagi at 10:20 a.m. on June 4, 1942. For 6 months your fleet has been unstoppable. You were there at Pearl Harbor, swept through the Indian Ocean, and every opponent you faced fell before your power. Below deck, crews arm the planes for what's meant to be the final decisive strike against the American fleet. The enemy's morning counterattack seemed weak and disorganized. You believe the worst is behind you, but you are about to be fatally mistaken. In just 5 minutes, everything will change. The mighty Japanese fleet, once the apex predator of the seas, will be engulfed in flames and destruction. How could such invincibility collapse so quickly? To grasp the shock of Midway for Japan, you must first understand the towering confidence that preceded it. After the stunning triumph at Pearl Harbor, the Kido Butai, Japan's first air fleet under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, embarked on a 6-month rampage across the Pacific. Built around 6 powerful carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, it was the most fearsome naval strike force on Earth. These ships were not just vessels, but floating airfields, crewed by the most skilled naval aviators alive, many hardened by years of combat in China. Their efficiency was unmatched. They could launch over 100 planes in less than 10 minutes, a pace the Americans could barely approach. After Pearl Harbor, their conquests seemed endless. They supported invasions across the Pacific, crushed Allied fleets at the Battle of the Java Sea, and in April 1942, Nagumo led a 5-carrier task force into the Indian Ocean, destroying the British carrier HMS Hermes and 2 heavy cruisers with ease. Japan appeared untouchable, its reach limitless. But this unbroken string of victories gave rise to a dangerous illusion, what Japanese officers would later call victory disease. Success bred arrogance. The high command came to believe their pilots were inherently superior, their plans infallible, and their spirit unbeatable. They dismissed warnings, ignored risks, and assumed their enemies lacked the will to fight. The Kido Butai's men, the finest aviators in the world, shared this supreme confidence. They had never known defeat and could not imagine it. That same belief carried them toward a small remote atoll in the Pacific, Midway. The architect of the Midway operation was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant yet often reckless commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. Despite Japan's triumphs, Yamamoto harbored deep concerns. Having studied in the United States, he understood America's immense industrial capacity. He knew Japan's window for victory was short, before American factories could overwhelm them with a flood of new ships and planes. Even Pearl Harbor had not been a complete success. The U.S. carriers had escaped. As long as they remained afloat, the threat persisted. When American bombers struck Tokyo during the Doolittle raid in April 1942, Yamamoto's fears were confirmed. The carriers had to be destroyed. Thus, Operation MI was born. Yamamoto envisioned Midway as the decisive battle of the war, a complex, elegant trap to lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into destruction. Midway Atoll would serve as bait, its strategic value ensuring an American response. When the U.S. Navy sailed to defend it, Japan's combined fleet would strike from ambush. The plan reflected the traditional Japanese love of intricate, multi-layered operations. A diversionary attack would hit the Aleutian Islands to the north, while the main force Nagumo's Kido Butai, with 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would first neutralize Midway's air defenses, then crush the American fleet. Hundreds of miles behind, Yamamoto followed aboard the super battleship Yamato, ready to finish the fight. Yet beneath its brilliance, the plan was fatally flawed, built on arrogance and false assumptions. Its success relied entirely on surprise, but Japan's naval codes were no longer secure. American cryptanalysts in Hawaii had already cracked much of the JN-25 code and correctly identified Midway as the target. To confirm it, U.S. intelligence cleverly sent a fake message about a water shortage at the base, which Japanese operators dutifully relayed. With that, the Americans knew both the time and place of the coming attack. As the Japanese fleet advanced in radio silence, believing itself unseen, Admiral Chester Nimitz was already positioning his own carriers to spring a devastating countertrap. The plan was simply too intricate. Everything relied on perfect timing from separate forces, scattered across hundreds of miles, all operating without radio chatter, which meant they could not come to one another's aid. In practice, Nagumo's carriers, the linchpin of the whole operation, were essentially isolated. Intelligence failures made matters worse. A reconnaissance flight over Pearl Harbor was cancelled. A submarine picket meant to screen for departing American carriers was positioned too late, and the Americans had already slipped past. The Japanese sailed toward Midway, convinced the US carriers were still tied to port, and they badly underestimated American repair work. The Yorktown, thought crippled after the Coral Sea, had been rushed back into service at Pearl Harbor, so the Americans would bring 3 carriers, not the 2 Tokyo expected. The warning signs were even visible in pre-battle exercises aboard Yamato, where a simulated American surprise strike that should have put 2 of Nagumo's carriers out of action was dismissed by the umpire as unlikely, a clear symptom of victory disease. Unaware they were walking into a trap, the Japanese fleet roared to life at 04:30 on June 4, launching a brilliant strike of 108 aircraft in 7 minutes to neutralize Midway's air defenses, while Nagumo deliberately held half his force in reserve, loaded with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, awaiting enemy ships. Midway's defenders responded with desperate, near-suicidal attacks. Veteran Japanese Zeros shredded their attackers, and anti-aircraft fire stopped any that got through, leaving Nagumo's ships seemingly unscathed and confidence high, until a terse 07 report from Lieutenant Tomaga demanded a second strike because the island had not been fully neutralized. That message plunged Nagumo into a terrible dilemma. Yamamoto's orders required keeping reserves armed for ship attacks, yet no American fleet had shown itself and his scouts reported only empty ocean. A cautious man by training, Nagumo reasoned to deal with the known problem, the island, before chasing a hypothetical fleet, and at 07:15 he gave the fateful order to rearm the reserve aircraft, swapping torpedoes and heavy anti-ship ordnance for land attack bombs. The hangars on all 4 carriers became scenes of controlled chaos, as crews labored for what could be more than an hour, leaving decks littered with armed planes, bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines, a deadly jumble. Then, just as rearming was underway, the situation flipped. At 07:28, a scout from the cruiser Toan, delayed by 30 crucial minutes, reported 10 enemy ships, and Nagumo countermanded instructions to prepare strikes against fleet units, telling crews to leave torpedoes on planes not yet changed to bombs, which only increased the confusion. At Ochino's a scout radioed again with the fatal detail. The force appeared to include an aircraft carrier. The hunters had become the hunted. On Hiryu's bridge, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi pressed for an immediate strike, urging Nagumo to send whatever he had to hit the Americans first, but Nagumo hesitated. Doctrine and training insisted on coordinated strikes with fighter escort. To launch piecemeal would expose bombers without protection. Complicating matters, his first strike group was returning low on fuel and needed to land. Carriers could not both recover and rearm launch/simultaneously. Faced with 2 terrible choices, Nagumo elected to wait and recover, the textbook decision that proved fatal. As the carriers turned into the wind to recover planes, flight decks were blocked, and the next American moves began. 3 squadrons of torpedo bombers from the US carriers attacked low and slow in obsolete TBD Devastators and were nearly annihilated. Of 41 aircraft, only a handful returned, and none scored hits, but their sacrifice drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level and out of position. By 10:20, as the last torpedo attack faded, the Kido Butai's decks were at last preparing for their counterstrike. On Akagi, Kaga and Soryu pilots sat in cockpits with engines warming and the ships turning into the wind to launch. Yet that was their most vulnerable moment, surrounded by armed aircraft, ordnance and fuel, and fate was about to close the trap. The Japanese fleet had absolutely no idea what was coming. Relentless torpedo attacks had forced their protective fighter screen down to the waves, leaving the skies above exposed and undefended. Without radar, the crews were effectively flying blind. At 10:24 a.m., a deck officer raised a white flag to signal the launch. As the first Zero fighter roared down the flight deck, a lookout's scream pierced the air. Helldivers! Out of the blinding sun, from nearly 20,000 feet, 36 American SBD Dauntless dive bombers appeared seemingly out of nowhere. They came from the Enterprise and the Yorktown, arriving undetected at the perfect moment. For the men on the decks below, there was no warning, only the shriek of diving planes seconds before impact. The attack was swift and brutally precise. The first bombs slammed into the carrier Kaga. One struck the bridge, killing the captain and his staff. A 1,000-pound bomb crashed through to the upper hangar, igniting a chain reaction among fully fueled and armed planes. In moments, Kaga was engulfed in fire. Nearby, Soryu was hit by bombers from the Yorktown. 3 bombs tore through her decks. one penetrating to the hangar and setting off explosions that doomed the ship within 20 minutes. The flagship Akagi took only one direct hit, but it was catastrophic. The bomb plunged into the upper hangar, detonating among armed torpedo bombers being prepared for launch. The entire hangar erupted in flame. Admiral Nagumo stood frozen in disbelief as his fleet burned around him, his officers dragging him off the blazing flagship. In just 5 minutes, the heart of the WWII was destroyed. 3 of Japan's finest carriers were reduced to burning wrecks. Japan's obsession with offensive capability had left their ships fatally vulnerable. Poor damage control, enclosed hangars filled with fueled planes, and no way to contain the inferno once it began. But the fight wasn't over yet. The lone surviving carrier, Hiryu, commanded by the determined Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, had been farther north and escaped the first wave. Wasting no time, Yamaguchi launched a counterattack. His aircraft located the USS Yorktown and struck with precision, hitting her with 3 bombs. A second wave followed, delivering 2 torpedoes that crippled the already damaged carrier. The Japanese pilots returned believing they had destroyed 2 American carriers, unaware they had hit the same ship twice. It was a final act of defiance. Late that afternoon, American scout planes located Hiryu. Dive bombers from the Enterprise swooped down, dropping 4 bombs that tore through her decks. By the next morning, the last of Nagumo's carriers had sunk beneath the Pacific waves. The sword of the Imperial Japanese Navy was broken. As the sun set on June 4th, the ocean burned with the dying light of the WWII. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and the heavy cruiser Mikuma were all gone. More than 3,000 Japanese sailors, officers, and technicians perished, among them the elite aviators and mechanics who formed the core of Japan's naval air power. These men were irreplaceable, their skill unmatched, and their loss crippled Japan's ability to wage modern naval warfare. Meanwhile, the United States was only beginning to reach its full industrial and military potential. The defeat was so devastating that the Japanese government immediately moved to conceal it. Officially, Midway was declared a victory. Survivors were brought home in secret, isolated, and forbidden from speaking of what truly happened, even to their families. The lost carriers remained listed on naval records for months, their fates hidden behind layers of silence. This culture of denial prevented the Imperial Navy from confronting its failures. Doctrinal flaws, poor intelligence, and rigid command structures were never corrected, because doing so meant acknowledging the enormity of the disaster. Midway became the undisputed turning point of the Pacific War. In a single day, Japan's offensive might was broken, and the strategic initiative passed to the United States. Never again would Japan mount a major naval offensive. The loss set the stage for the long, grinding war of attrition in the Solomon Islands. Beginning with the US landings on Guadalcanal just 2 months later, a war Japan was doomed to lose. From the Japanese perspective, Midway stands as a haunting lesson in pride and misjudgment. A fleet at the very height of its power, blinded by arrogance and past victories, engineered its own destruction. An overcomplicated plan, a fatal underestimation of the enemy, and a moment of hesitation at the worst possible time doomed the world's most powerful carrier force. The 5 minutes of chaos over the WWII on June 4th didn't just sink 4 carriers, they ended the Empire's dreams of dominance. The Battle of Midway remains a timeless warning, how pride, flawed assumptions, and the fog of war can bring even the mightiest to ruin. It's not merely a tale of ships and planes, but of human decisions and fatal hubris that sealed an empire's fate. If you found this look into the other side of Midway insightful, consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. We explore the lesser-known sides of history's greatest turning points every week. Let us know in the comments what you believe was the single most decisive factor in Japan's defeat, Nagumo's hesitation, the flawed battle plan, or sheer misfortune. We'd love to hear your thoughts.